Thanks so much for coming to this event. My name's Anoosh Chakelian and I'm Britain editor of the new Statesman. I'll be chairing the discussion. Thanks so much for coming to this event by Power to Change, where we'll be asking, is levelling up delivering for communities? A year on from the publication of the Levelling Up white paper, remember that? 4 years since levelling up became a central part of the government's agenda, and less than a week since the latest budget, whose levelling up policies seem to centre around 12 new Canary Wharfs. Power to Change is launching a new report entitled Work in Progress, Levelling Up Perspectives from a Community and National Level. And for anyone interested in this policy area, the wider social fabric, the state of the public realm and public attitudes towards their neighbourhoods and the spaces around them, it is a vital read. The report analyses the progress of the levelling up agenda so far, specifically from the perspectives of communities and community businesses around the country, taking in insights from interviews with community business leaders and the wider public through national polling, which has had some very interesting results, some of which you can read on the New Statesman. We very kindly, thanks to Power to Change, had previous sight of the report and managed to put out the story yesterday. The report focuses its conclusions on the nature of levelling up funding and how it's allocated, how to devolve power and to whom, the state of our high streets and civic pride, and community ownership. To discuss these themes today, I'm delighted to be joined by the following expert panellists: Josh Westerling, Public Affairs Officer at Power to Change; Jo Cooper, Chief Executive of Back on the Map; Zoe Billingham, Director of IPPR North; and Adam Hawksbee, Deputy Director of Onward. First of all, I'm going to ask each panellist to present their thoughts on the core question, is levelling up delivering for communities, for 5 to 7 minutes or so. And once they've all spoken, I'll be taking questions from the audience, so feel free to start sending your questions in as our panellists are speaking. Josh, I'd like to go to you first so that you can tell us a bit about the report.
Thanks, Anoosh, and thanks, Jo, Adam and Zoe for joining. Should be a really interesting discussion. So I think the first thing to say is kind of why we published this report. If you mention levelling up in policy circles, you're likely to hear a bit of a groan, maybe a sigh, and questions like whether we still need to keep talking about it. And I think our view of Power to Change is, yes, like levelling up very much matters, and it matters for communities and for community business. So this report in part is an attempt to kind of keep levelling up on the policy agenda. But it's also an assessment of the progress that's been made so far and the impact that levelling up is having, both in the view of the public and of communities and community business. And our assessment is that it's a work in progress that isn't yet delivering for communities as it could and as it should. So in reviewing the progress, we looked at the areas that are most relevant to our focus at Power to Change on communities and community business. We looked at levelling up funding, devolution and community power, high streets and pride in place, and community ownership. On levelling up funding, we found that it's been hampered by complex and resource-intensive bidding processes. There's been delays in funding allocation, and the short-term and fragmented nature of the funding pots kind of characterises how the funding has taken place. We think there needs to be significant reform to this funding so it reaches both the places that need it most and so that the community can be more involved in funding bids. I think there's been good progress on devolution. 14 areas have agreed devolution settlements, and we saw the enhanced devolution deals for West Midlands and Greater Manchester recently. But we want to see continued progress on this so that devolution of power doesn't just stop at the regional level, it also goes down to the neighbourhood level, so communities have more control over the decisions that affect their lives. We think there's been a strong commitment to tackle high street decline, and there's tangible policy in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill on high street rental auctions. But we want to see this kind of modified slightly so it really tackles the core issue of high street decline, which is the nature of property ownership on the high street. And we think the government should be looking at a community right to buy as a way of tackling this. Similarly, on the Community Ownership Fund, government's made kind of welcome changes since it launched the fund, such as introducing early stage support. But we want to see kind of more progress in other areas of community ownership. For example, the community spaces and relationship strategy that the government announced in the white paper. We'd like to see that actually taken forward. So despite some of this progress, I think it's fair to say, looking at the polling in our report that Opinion conducted for us, this hasn't translated into impact in the minds of the public. 56% of people don't think levelling up is having an impact in their local area, 14% think it's having a negative impact, and only 11% see it having a positive impact. I think tellingly, on specific areas like high streets, which are really a key prism through which people view their local area and therefore would kind of see whether levelling up's taking any effect, 64% of people think that their high streets declined since 2019. And when you look at the kind of top issues for the public, high streets comes in at number 4 when people are talking about their local area. So it's still a significant issue in the minds of the public. And similarly, looking ahead to the future, to 2030, which is the kind of time frame for the levelling up missions, only 48% of people think that levelling up won't have an impact by that time. And this isn't just a Conservative issue. Labour aren't net trusted on levelling up either. And I think despite the party kind of putting forward its case a bit more in recent months on it, I think there's still work to do for the party to kind of win over the public on this. So I'll let Jo talk a bit more about the kind of community level perspective from Sunderland, but kind of the top lines from our interviews with community business leaders from across England was that levelling up's been too focused on capital investment, and that this has felt kind of disconnected from local people. This, combined with the time lag for projects actually taking place, means that people really aren't perceiving an impact in their local area. Similarly, in terms of the funding, there's this perceived focus on shovel-ready initiatives that are already in the pipeline rather than new and perhaps less kind of physical infrastructure projects. So community business leaders like us want to see kind of power go down to the neighbourhood level, flexibility and funding, and metrics beyond the economic to be recognised by government. So we don't think that all hope is lost on levelling up. There is kind of scope for government to make changes before the next election, and for a future government to make quite significant changes to kind of carry forward the agenda. So we think that on high streets, government should be looking at community right to buy, as I said previously, but there's also proposals for a high street buyout fund, which Power to Change has developed alongside our community improvement district pilots, which could provide a model for government to put communities in the lead of high street regeneration. We also think government needs to implement these changes to levelling up funding. I think there's actually a kind of cross-party consensus on this, essentially, and I don't quite know why that hasn't yet kind of translated into change from central government, but perhaps it will soon. And we think, yeah, government should also produce the community spaces and relationship strategy. I'd also look further into neighbourhood governance, as it promised in the white paper, which can provide a real mechanism for power and resources to reach that neighbourhood level. In terms of Labour, there's been lots of promising rhetoric, I think, from Keir Starmer in his New Year's speech, talking about how communities can take back control, and the promise of a take back control bill in a future Labour government's first King's speech, if they do get in. But that really needs to translate into policy substance, and we think proposals like a Community Power Act from the We're Right Here campaign could provide a mechanism to make that rhetoric a reality. And we think that Labour should also be looking at solutions to secure funding for communities and community business. So at the moment, Mark Gregory is heading up Lisa Nandy's Community Wealth Commission, and we think this could be a good avenue for the party to explore that funding. So I think in the short answer to the question is levelling up delivering for communities is not yet, but there's scope to make more changes before the next election. And yeah, that's all from me. Look forward to discussing more.
Thanks so much, Josh. That was a brilliant introduction. And now I want to hand over to Jo.
Thanks, Anoosh. Yeah, how do I follow that, Josh? I suppose from a community point of view, I think Levelling Up really did capture people's imagination. People were really optimistic about the potential that it held for grassroots community to really have a say on place-based initiatives that they thought would improve their areas. I mean, in Sunderland, we've certainly had awards of Levelling Up funds. So 20 million has gone to the city to look at job creation in higher paid skilled work for the future economy of the city, and a major new green housing development which will move the town westward. But how that is felt by the existing population in communities that are really facing the hardest, toughest economic, social and moral disadvantage, I don't think that's translated. I don't think communities, certainly in Hendon where I work, who are facing some of those real challenges around poverty and deprivation, they don't understand how that in 2030 is going to improve the lives of them and their children and their grandchildren. They don't really feel the tangible benefits yet. And whether that's a communication piece or really getting those local people involved so their voices are heard in how that's delivered, I think that's part of the challenge for the council, but also for central government, because yes, devolution of power is fantastic as long as it's not the same people's voices being heard all the time. So we're a community improvement district area in Hendon. Our local high street is one of the 5 pilots for the country, and that I think has really demonstrated how much local people really care about the place they live. It's really captured their imaginations. We've gone from having real apathy with our traders and stakeholders because they feel completely left behind and that nobody cared about their area, and that the high street was just continually declining and no one was ever going to help come in and support them and help to turn that around. Now, through having the community improvement district status and having some interest and some initial funds to sort of work with those people, gather their voices, build momentum, and just make small steps towards improving and working together to make their area a little bit better, has really, really, as I say, captured the imagination of not just our traders and stakeholders and partners, but residents as well. They feel like they're being heard, listened to and cared about again. And I think that can't be underestimated, how important that is in transforming places and people feeling that they do have opportunities in the future and these initiatives are for them, that they can be listened to. The devolution of power, when we talk about that, we mean real people in real communities where they have faced decades of austerity, decades of poverty, and really giving people an opportunity for that to be equitable and fair to them, I think is so important. So what we want to see as a community, business, charity, working on the front line in grassroots communities is the potential to be realised, and local people to be put at the heart of that, because you know people in these communities know exactly what they need, and they don't need to be done to. It needs to be with communities. We really need to put the communities back on the map, so to speak.
Great, thanks so much, Jo. That was a brilliant perspective. And I want to move on to Zoe next, and then we'll have Adam fourth.
Brilliant, thanks Anoosh, and to Josh and the team for hosting this event today and the publication of your report. I think the sort of title sums it up pretty nicely, work in progress. You know, there are plenty of ideas and bits of policy in place, but I guess my overall sense of where we're at is that there's been some welcome moves, whether that's on the community agenda. We saw the additional 100 million at budget just now. But fundamentally, I wonder whether structurally anything's really changed in our economy. I think the exception to that is on devolution. And I think this government and the previous Conservative governments that we've had over the last few years will probably see that as the legacy of levelling up, and sort of that will be badged as levelling up in action, which I think is part of the story, because giving power to places across the country in the form of whether that's metro mayors or devolution deals is part of the answer. But I think aside from that, I don't see that there's been much structural change. And as we just heard from Jo, when the kind of reality of what started out as a sort of what's been referred to as boosterism, like a very positive agenda about kind of the future of a place and investment and future economies, and that sort of collided with the reality of the combination of austerity, Brexit, and a cost of living crisis. And so levelling up, as it was kind of introduced in 2009, albeit it's not the first attempt to reduce regional inequality, in my mind, kind of, you know, spoke to a sort of positivity about the future, but it kind of jars a bit now when actually the lived reality of people across the country is, you know, 3 in 10 adults still struggling to put food on the table and record food bank usage. You know, it's hard to talk about boosterism when that's the reality of the people that the agenda is meant to help. As I mentioned, I think, you know, the Trailblazer devolution deals that got agreed in or got announced at budget in Greater Manchester and West Midlands, a really welcome step in terms of properly empowering mayors with single pot, you know, bringing together multiple funds that they have to deal with and different accountability lines and all the rest of it, and bringing those together in one place and properly trusting and empowering mayors to kind of make decisions locally. And I think that's a really welcome step in the next direction. I think, as Josh flagged, there's the kind of double devolution question still looms large, you know, and I think us at IPPR North institutionally, we've always, you know, we've championed the mayoral agenda and been very much part of the design of it. I think the next stage now is to say, well, how are metro mayors and how is devolution delivering differently? What's, you know, people have talked about Andy Burnham being like a Whitehall department. Well, I don't want him to be like a Whitehall department. I've worked in Whitehall and I know how Whitehall works. I want to see how Andy Burnham works differently, even if he has the powers of several government departments. So that's how we at IPPR North will be kind of, you know, holding the government's feet to the fire on making sure that this next round of handing power down, at least to the metro mayor level, if not community, is done in a way that is going to allow them to respond to local needs and to demonstrate how government can be done differently. But I'll just finish on saying, back to the point that I started on, that aside from the devolution agreements, and of course in the north we've now got 74% of people living within a devolution deal. For the rest of England it's just over 50%, so that's a big thing. But aside from that, I think that the agenda now jars with the lived reality of people across the country. And as Josh says, you know, people look to their high streets as a kind of indicator of how their place is doing, how the economy is doing. When we do participatory work with Power to Change and others across the country, we also hear that public services are another kind of litmus test. And when public services are under pressure, not delivering, long waiting times, libraries closing, you know, that's another kind of litmus test, if you will, for people to look at their local area and say, is this place getting better or worse? And I think on many counts, public services being under pressure as they are also getting worse. So high streets and public services, if they're the two kind of real economy tests, I think this agenda is struggling. So what could be done structurally? Just briefly, just to put a few ideas in the mix that maybe we can pick up in conversation. I think to structurally change the economy, I think what the report focuses on today on kind of funding is obviously a critical one. It's not the only one. I think industrial strategy has been kind of waved around as something that, you know, was local industrial strategies, then was a national agenda. Businesses need long-term certainty to invest in places, and tax breaks at the margins won't cut it. So we need some proper engagement with business to work out what our country's industrial mix looks like going forward. And then net zero is another opportunity that I think was missed at the budget in terms of determining, you know, how we're going to future-proof our economy whilst bringing people along up and down the country and improving the spaces and places they live. So those are my kind of challenges to the agenda, and looking forward to getting stuck into discussion.
Thanks so much, Zoe. That was really interesting. And I will finish with Adam, and then we will start taking questions. So do get your questions in.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anoosh and Josh. Power to Change. Thank you for having me along. A typically fantastic report from you guys. I'm very pleased that you continue to bang the drum on community businesses and their importance. I want to chat about three things, kind of what degree there's actually been some progress. I want to talk about High Street specifically, as I think is a really good example of the kind of centre local balance in levelling up. And then I want to talk about the politics of this, and if it is the case that levelling up has been somewhat underwhelming, why that has probably been the case in terms of politics, and why I think those politics will continue to be tricky for the next government, whatever political party they are comprised of. So on progress, I do not think on the communities element of the levelling up agenda, there has been sufficient progress. I think there have been some really good examples of policies that organisations like ours, like Power to Change, have called for. The Community Ownership Fund, I think, is a really good initiative. I think the fact that actually government listened on the second round and it was, here are the problems with it, you need to change it, and they did make a change to that fund, I think is excellent, and is actually not a normal level of responsiveness you see on community policy from departments. I think things like the high street rental auctions could be really powerful tools, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But I think that some of the promise that was in that levelling up white paper, a lot of it driven by Danny Kruger, around community covenants, around new approaches to double devolution, have not been realised. And there were various strategies and consultations in that paper that are somewhere in the Whitehall machine, and we need to keep banging the drum so that they see the light of day. So they can either be delivered before an election or they can be picked up after one. But it's in all of our interest to get those things out there as soon as they can. I do think that devolution at a regional level has been progress. I'm really, I'm a big evangelist for mayoral devo. I think it's a fantastic thing, and I think the government have done good work on it. I think it is fundamentally different to community policy and localism. There are 3 million people that live in the West Midlands. That's bigger than many countries. And so while it is fantastic, and I think it's a great thing to have more powers over housing and skills and transport, and I believe they should doubly devolve a lot of those powers on things like active travel and transport, down to local authorities, down to parish councils, down to community groups. We need to be keeping the pressure up on both of those agendas, mayoral devo, industrial strategy skills, and community asset transfer, assets of community value, that sort of stuff as well. And so I assure you, I'm always quick when a government minister says, oh, but we're doing levelling up, we've done devo. You say, fine, but there's this other bit here that's really important, which touches individuals, members of the community organisations like Joe's, far more directly than Andy Street or Andy Burnham or any other mayor having a lot of power. On the national polling element in terms of progress, two words of caution on that. So one is what the public mean when they hear levelling up, and I think it is probably rarely community groups and their empowerment. I wish it were, but it is rarely that. I think it's more often, to Zoe's point, is my high street or town centre looking good or bad? Now, of course, that relates to community groups, but that's often the proxy. I think public services is also a proxy. Our work has indicated that crime and antisocial behaviour is actually the #1 proxy about whether your area is levelled up or not. And polling from More in Common and polling from UK and Changing Europe has reinforced that view. So when we're thinking about how do people respond in national polls on progress, I think it's important to keep that in mind, that it's this broader definition. And the other, so I was furiously Googling before this session. So I saw, Joe, that your organisation was originally from New Deal for Communities. And we've done a lot of work looking at why New Deal for Communities is actually a fantastic example of a programme, not perfect by any means, but it did some stuff right in terms of bringing funding right down to the community level, community voices being in the lead. So in 2000, I found some polling from 2004 about how many people that lived in an NDC area felt that their area was improving. And so it's about 5 years into the programme. And that number was 24%, which is kind of ridiculously low, right? This was by many measures a successful programme, but it shows how hard it is for policy to cut through and for people to say X policy has improved my life. So the target we're looking for, I think in your poll, it was about 11% nationally. We've got to double that figure and more. We've got to do it very, very quickly. And I think that is still a high target, but is important context. So what does that mean? So progress, nowhere near enough. What does that mean in terms of high street specifically? I worry sometimes that in terms of progress on levelling up, that we, even as organisations that believe in localism, focus a lot on the extra thing the centre can do to enable local areas to get moving. Now, to be clear on funding, there is absolutely a case that the centre and Whitehall have gutted local government funding, and that was an enormous mistake in 2010. but I'm more sceptical of calls for additional powers or mechanisms from the centre. And so while I think We're Right Here are a phenomenal organisation and the thrust of their argument is right, the call for a Community Power Act I'm more sceptical of, until things like Section 215, high street rental auctions, community asset transfer, updated list of assets of community value. Now, of course, it's not within the gift of civil society organisations to do some of this. Local authorities need to as well. But there's a huge amount more that local authorities, district, county, metropolitan councils need to be doing. And I really want policymakers and others to be working with those organisations to make sure they're exhausting every power available to them currently, as well as keeping pressure up on government to give them support. So I think that balance, high streets are a great example. Yes, there's lots the centre needs to do. I think there's a lot more that local areas can do, which, as I think one of the questions just came in on, they'd be freer to do if they weren't filling out a bunch of forms all the time to try and get more central government money. Could not agree more. We need to get rid of those processes. Let me quickly talk about the politics, because I think one of the reasons that levelling up has not been to the fore in the way that it should have been in the past year is that the Truss government in particular and the impact that had on economic competence has shifted the nature of the political debate and what members of the public want from their politicians, which seems to be a sort of, and the polling indicates this, not a big radical transformation. If you poll people about whether you prefer gradual change or radical change, it's often, I think, regrettably, gradual change. And what they really prioritise is economic competence, stability, action on the things that matter. They're tired of big, bold promises. Their view is plague on all their houses. No one delivers on these things. And so they just want things to be done. Now, for people like us, for me, who want big, radical, serious change to the structure of our economy, that's a real problem because it pushes politicians towards stability, regularity, and order. And I think that is what you're seeing from both front benches at the moment. Whether that is Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges, which do not include levelling up, whether that's Rachel Reeves saying that she doesn't want councils to have tax raising powers. That's not because she's anti-devolution, it's because anything that sounds like higher taxes is a real risk to the Labour brand. Politics of this are difficult. And I think, and I'll finish on this, there's a divide in politics that isn't left-right, but is a kind of communitarian against a kind of third-way liberal approach. I'm deliberately not trying to use phrases like kind of Blairite or Cameroon, because they're bigger than those individuals. But while both, I think, believe in communities and believe in community policy, there is a real difference of prioritization. I think communitarians say that one of the biggest, or if not the biggest, binding constraint to economic transformation is the degree to which power is hoarded by a small number of people. That might be in our economy, that might be in our politics, etc. And third ways liberals will kind of say, sometimes it's necessary to centralize things in order to make big systems move, right? And that was a core tenet, both at the start of the Blair government and the start of the Cameron government. That matters because doing some of the stuff we're describing, this community work, is enormously difficult. The Devo deals that just happened are a step in the right direction. They are quite marginal in some places. They were enormously difficult for even someone like Michael Gove that really understands Whitehall, and a number 10 and officials in number 10 and political appointees in number 10 that are really supportive of this. Just getting that through was really hard. And the question is never, do we want to empower communities or not? It's, do we want to fight with the Treasury on empowering communities or reforming the NHS or changing the benefit system or, right? And that prioritization will differ between the communitarian wing of the parties, and the kind of third way liberal wing. Lisa Nandy is not the Labour Party. I wish that she were, but there are different voices in the Labour Party, and I think that's going to be really important. And I fight those fights within my own party, within the Conservatives all the time. But I guess I say that as a sort of call to arms. The people that are here and the people on the call, if levelling up is going to work for communities, it will require all of us in our respective parties, factions, groups, wings, parts of the country to bang the drum that it's not just that communities are a nice to have, that they are central to the change we need to see. And if we do that, then I hope we'll see some more progress in the coming years. I'll pause there.
Thanks so much, Adam. Yeah, I think there's a lot of people who wish that Lisa Nandy was the Labour Party. Probably many of them in the audience of this event. So we've got some great questions coming through. The first one is, in his foreword to the Levelling Up white paper, Boris Johnson said that the purpose of Levelling Up was to take the radical steps needed to make us more prosperous and more united by tackling the regional and local inequalities that unfairly hold back communities and to encourage private sector investment right across the UK. So what radical steps does the panel think the government has taken so far, and what radical steps should it take over the next 18 months? And do panel members agree that the ultimate aim of levelling up should be about prosperity and private sector investment? Who wants to go first on that question? Josh, maybe I'll go to you, seeing as you spoke.
Thanks, Anoosh. So I think in terms of the most radical changes that the government's made, I think in the context of this country, which is incredibly over-centralised, I think the changes that they have made in terms of devolution are quite radical. Like, they might not be radical in Germany, but like, they feel radical here. In terms of changes that they need to make for the future, I mean, there's the recommendations in the report that I think are important. I think in terms of levelling up, the scale of funding that is most likely needed is something that neither party, I think, have the appetite for at the moment, and would be a radical change for either of them to make. And no, I don't think levelling up is just about the private sector. I think there's a lot of recognition in the wider white paper of the importance of communities, of social infrastructure, and I think the kind of people who are still kind of pushing levelling up within the Conservative Party. I mean, if you read Michael Gove's speech at Onward the other day on the future of conservatism, I think that kind of direction is kind of where levelling up needs to go, and I think where the Conservative Party also would want to go if they kind of want to maintain some of that kind of 2019 coalition, which is what levelling up was kind of created to serve.
Thanks, Josh. Who wants to come in? Adam, I saw you unmuted quite fast there. Should we go for you and then Zoe?
I think I was unmuted from my previous comments, but
oh, right.
so no. But so in terms of radical things, I do not think there have been steps that are radical enough yet, either on the kind of structural transformation of how government works side, or on the policy side. I do so Zoe's point about industrial policy and strategy, I had to really resist the urge to like rip up my comments and just talk for 7 minutes about that, because I think Zoe's absolutely right. That's going to be a huge part of how we level up and change our economy. I do think that although the words industrial policy and industrial strategy for some reason can't be used at the moment by politicians, the more recent incarnation of investment zones and the way that they were focused on particular sectors were not just tax cuts, but involved coordinating a whole range of funding. I think that was interesting, and that showed a willingness to be a bit more directional and deliberate about economic development. That's the sort of direction of travel that I want to see. Is that radical? No, almost certainly not. And it needs to go much further, but combined with devolution, it could have radical results. Do I think the levelling up needs to be about prosperity overall? I think I probably do, yes. I think that it needs to have a growth focus, not a growth defined as GDP, all of Diane Coyle's stuff, redefining GDP to include well-being and a range of other measures, I think is right. But that growth needs to be growth that members of communities can touch, taste, feel and benefit from, not a very narrow version. But if we don't anchor it in a version of growth and prosperity, and I recognise some people view those as very different terms, then I think it's not going to cut through with the public.
Thank you. Zoe?
Yeah, thank you. I think as radical as it gets, it's the Trailblazer Devo deals for me. But yeah, radical is maybe too strong a word, but in terms of where most progress has been made, I think given we're 18 months out of a general election now, timing's getting rather tight for the government to change tack and be radical. But of course, I've got a long list of ideas. I mean, things that could do, I mean, for instance, the 12 missions are welcome, but no sense of prioritization. Pick your metric that you're going to get measured against, and then go hell for leather for that. Obviously, as Adam said, kind of investment zones, the start of a good idea, but not at scale and not long term enough. But whether they can't obviously commit a future government to committing to that. So again, that couldn't be done without the impossible. And I think this kind of question about private sector, of course, this is about private sector investment as well as public sector investment. And actually, when we combine these two stats of public and private sector investment, the UK is currently 35 out of 38 in terms of the OECD comparator country, so we're doing absolutely terribly. And I think as long as the government recognises that the way you get private sector investment, as well as a kind of stable policy environment and long-term commitments, is also the crowding in effect of public sector investment, which I know some in the current government have pushed back about as an idea in itself. But that's something that I would very much support. And so, as Josh said, therefore it is about the scale that the state is willing to kind of put its money where its mouth is, and help use that to crowd in private long-term investment. So I think the two are inextricably linked.
Great, thank you. Jo, would you like to come in on this question as well before we move on to the next one?
I think I would just agree with what Zoe said. I think, and Adam, I don't necessarily think it's radical, but I suppose that's your viewpoint on radical, isn't it? Because what Boris might think is radical and what we think is radical will be very different things. I think there needs to be, I mean, if, as Adam said, the public wants stability, there needs to be a planned and long-term strategic approach to it. It's not just about markets and private business investment, because, we didn't get to this place that we're in the worst communities because market failed, right? So, you can't rely on just the markets to make it better. And as Zoe rightly said, it's going to take a great amount of public spending to reverse the decline. But that's going to be over a long period of time, which people need to recognise. And maybe the radical bit is it needs to be cross-party and a long-term commitment, because, that is just what we never see. And we're in this constant political swinging around of what everybody thinks people want to hear, and very little being delivered for communities that are suffering.
Matt, just drop back in, because actually, as Jo was speaking, I thought of something the government could do. It would be very radical for them, though. So this is something I had on a watch for budget, but I would equalise the rate of taxation between wealth and income, and use the 12.5 billion generated from that to invest in our poorest communities. That's what I would do. But politically, we're a long way off that. So I'm just going to put it out there in order to plant some seeds in people's minds as well as those watching. And we'll for sure IPPR be pushing on that. But I know politically we're a long way off, and I don't think that's the kind of radicalism this government's up for.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, that's a measure that's being talked about a lot. I was at an event the day before the budget in Parliament. There were Tory politicians calling for it then as well. So maybe there's a sort of chink in the political consensus for that to come through at some point. The next question
wasn't that a policy by that famous radical Philip Hammond?
Yeah, I think it was originally in Nigel Lawson's budget. So.
There we go.
There's definitely
you agree with Nigel Lawson all the time.
Yeah. All right. So the next question that's come through: is there a north-south divide in levelling up? I really like this question. I'd like to go to Jo first, because Jo is representing her community. Jo, would you like to come in on that first?
I think would be really like the obvious answer is yes. There is always a north-south divide, right? And then the poor people in the Midlands don't get included in either of that. But yeah, I think the north is the forgotten friend, to be polite. I think the north wears the chip on its shoulder, the northeast certainly, that it's left behind and forgotten, and sort of the poor relation. But I think what the north lacks in terms of wealth and capital, it has vastly more in terms of social community and a real heart of wanting to be optimistic about the future. And the people are absolutely its best asset. And if that could be recognised more by policymakers, maybe would see a proper devolution and a proper dissemination of wealth, so that the north can really prosper. I think they're maybe just a bit scared of us.
Thanks so much. That was beautifully put. Does anyone else want to come in on the north-south divide question? Zoe? Yeah,
I'm happy to. I think yes, in certain areas. There we go. I've completely policy wonked that answer. I mean, the way I see it, it's the divides are in wealth, power, and opportunity, and I think there are some areas that are talked about, and certainly at IPPR North we're asked all the time by journalists to talk about any issue into the north-south divide, and I draw a hard line in some areas, because in some areas it's simply not the case, and actually life up north can be very lovely, believe it or not. For those, I live in Liverpool anyway, one for another day. But so I do think we need to be careful in which areas, and I refuse to accept that framing for everything, because that's simply not the case. And of course, within region inequality is also very important. That doesn't undermine the fact that there is north to south divide in certain areas, but of course sometimes we need to look closer to home too.
Great, thanks. Adam, you mentioned the allocation of the different funding pots, and every time this money goes out, there's always people trying to work out whether the south or the north sort of won. What do you make of the north-south divide question?
So I think Zoe is kind of spot on in terms of in some places and in some ways. I think broadly it is reasonable to say, and there is lots of evidence, that over the last 10, 15 years, there's been a massive imbalance in public investment in a range of different ways that have gone into the north and the south. And that's for all sorts of policy reasons that should be addressed, like the 80-20 rule in housing and all the rest of it. So I think it's undeniable that there's been a north-south divide in terms of the attention and investment of politics. That does not mean that every area in the south is paved with gold and is enormously prosperous. And I think it's absolutely possible to hold both those things in the debate at once. I think on the funding allocation point, so there's been a question that's popped in a couple of times about the Union and about Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and about some of the different approaches to funding. I think a really interesting thing that's happening with levelling up funding in relation to Scotland is the fact that some of these funds, the Shared Prosperity Fund, Community Renewal Fund, Levelling Up Fund, have kind of bypassed Holyrood and gone straight from the centre of government through to individual places. And we're actually doing some work at the moment with Ian Stewart, the former Scottish minister, looking at the legacy of the growth deals, which actually started in the kind of mid-2010s, and what the kind of approach they took to funding, which was very much devolved, long-term sort of stuff. I think many of us would want levelling up funds to look like, often a 10-year window, not even just a single spending review. And I think there's a lot that can be learned from the way that Whitehall, Holyrood, local authorities in Scotland, actually local authorities in England, there were some of those growth deals in Scotland which crossed the boundaries of the devolved administrations. There's a huge amount that can be learned from that for future levelling up funding. And my hope is that because that's managed by the kind of Scotland office as opposed to DLUC, that actually those conversations happen. That's one of the things we're trying to encourage with this work that we're doing with Ian.
Great, thank you. Sorry about that. Josh, do you want to come in on that, and we will go to the next question?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what's been said before. I think the north-south divide clearly does exist, and I think it's a kind of useful way of talking about the inequality that does exist within England. I think probably more accurately, it's a kind of London and the southeast and the rest of England divide. As Adam said, like lots of places in the south will also there also isn't that kind of opportunity there that there might be in London. And I think there's similarly kind of divides along kind of the opportunities that people might have if they live in a kind of major city or university town compared to, say, smaller post-industrial towns as well. So I think north-south divide it's a good prism, I think, to kind of capture the inequality that exists within England, but we also need to kind of recognise the nuances of that, whether it's urban, rural, city, town, London, and the rest.
Thank you. And our next question: councils leading on levelling up funding applications can be positive, as they can bring agents of change together into one bid, but it can also leave out community-led initiatives that are newer or don't fit a specific political agenda. Is there a way community groups can access this themselves? I think this is a great question, because I think you've all touched on the limitations of this kind of money going just to councils and not sort of beyond. So who wants to come in first on this one?
I think if I come in quickly on a kind of something that we heard from one of the community business leaders that we spoke to as part of the report in Leicester. So this was, as I understand it, the kind of city council was consulting about how it would use, it was either UK Shared Prosperity Fund or one of the other levelling up funds, and opened this consultation process. And essentially there was almost kind of like a community organising approach from the local social sector, who then kind of attended all these calls, made sure that they were kind of well represented alongside private sector and other aspects of the local area. So then they were really able to make sure that social economy community businesses were recognised as important as part of that bid as private sector and other local stakeholders. So I think that clearly there's, like we all agree, there's problems with the current funding. I think there are kind of quite impressive kind of ways that people in their own local area kind of making the best of it to try kind of almost not hijack the process, but make sure it kind of benefits their sector locally as well.
All right, can I come in on this?
Yes, yes, please come in. Yeah.
So in my old role up in the West Mids, I was the kind of responsible officer for the Community Renewal Fund, which was a complete nightmare of a fund, and you know the timelines and all the rest of it were horrendous. I learned two things from that. One, we got given capacity funding for each of our local authorities that were a priority area in the West Mids. Unsurprisingly, I think 6 of our 7 were. And we made the decision early on to give about half of that capacity funding to voluntary and community sector umbrella organisations who were better placed to engage with community groups than we were. And they were enormously reluctant to kind of take that funding because they said, look, you're setting us up for a fall here. This fund's a nightmare. We don't really trust you guys as a combined authority, and they're right not to because we're not good at dealing with community groups. But actually that then built a relationship after a lot of work and a lot of time that I think has been able to be drawn down on the Shared Prosperity Fund. So the key thing is you need to be able to top slice funds to build capacity in intermediary organisations, because you're never going to have a combined authority or a local authority reaching right down to the sort of neighbourhood level groups that you need to. I think the second thing on the politics was, I don't think we are clear as a sort of country or set of policymakers about what we want the relationship between electoral politics and community development to be. So we had a lot of local authority leaders saying, I want to sign off the proposals that come from my patch. But then we had local authorities bidding for CRF funding alongside community groups. And so local politicians couldn't be involved because they had their own bids in the mix. And similarly, I did a select committee thing recently, and a Labour MP was asking me how outrageous it was that, you know, Tory politicians have been deciding what projects got funded off, but then Labour politicians are very keen to be involved as the individuals signing off levelling up fund bids from their constituency. Now, look, of course, those two things aren't exactly the same, but I think we need to decide, do we want political champions for some local projects, or do we actually want to depoliticise that project because we want grassroots voices to come through? There are good arguments on both sides, but I think we need to recognise that's a trade-off.
Jo, I'd be interested to hear how you feel about the role of the council and the work that you do.
I mean, we have a really positive relationship with Sunderland Council. They are very supportive of the voluntary sector. They're investing quite a significant amount of funds into creating a new infrastructure body in Sunderland for the voluntary sector, because it's lacked that in the last 10 years, to be honest. Recently joined the board of that alliance so that more voices can be heard. And then they've used that as a mechanism to disseminate some of the levelling of funds, or certainly hear from the sector where things like the UK Shared Prosperity, what the local priorities are in communities for those funds. It hasn't made the process in the community groups and organisations, community businesses applying for those funds. It hasn't improved the process or systems because it's still very, very complex, and the workload is pretty onerous for a small community business to apply to them. But at least in terms of priorities and agenda, the voice of the sector and therefore the communities that they represent is being heard in Sunderland. So I think that is a positive step forward. I mean, yeah, like Adam says, we've got to decide what it is we want from community businesses and what that involvement looks like. And I think in local authorities, there's always that political fight. I mean, certainly in Sunderland, we have the constant battle of the elected members wanting to carve out something for their own agendas. And that probably happens in cities all across the country, and it often prevents really good work happening because of a political agenda.
Great, thank you. And Zoe, do you want to come in on this? And then we have another question about the role of local authorities that I will try and squeeze into.
Yeah, it's exactly this sort of, how do you, just picking up on what Joe was just saying, like how do you systematize, wonky word, but like how do you make like that engagement, and it's more than consultation, right? It's like, how do you make the structure of local government so that it's not just up to one enlightened local authority leader or councillor or whatever as to how that's run locally. And I think you know, we see and so I think that's where the conversation is at now. That feels like the frontier. We've got lots of good examples, whether that's participation through things like standing citizen juries or kind of more involved consultation processes to get in the views of community, whether it's like co-developing things with the community hand in hand as equal partners. You know, like there's lots of really good examples. It's just, how do we make that a bit more kind of widespread across the country, so we kind of can say what the overall approach is, as opposed to picking out good and bad examples.
Yes, and actually we do have I'm glad you mentioned that, because we do have a follow-up question about whether or not the panel can give any of your examples of where you think, you know, local authorities have successfully levelled up their high streets or communities without central government investment. So yeah, taking it away from the idea that that central government can sort of solve everything. I don't know if anyone has any cases that they have at the front of their mind. It doesn't have to be local authorities, it can also be other bodies, if you can think of any good examples.
Yeah, I mean, two that are often pointed to in the north are Wigan and Preston. I mean, I think sort of work in progress, but that's very much communities going and local government hand in hand going, well, hang on a minute, we can't guarantee, because we don't know what the formula is that government uses to allocate funding in advance. So we've kind of got to kind of do things for ourselves a bit, and how can we make sure that we're drawing on the businesses and assets and people within our communities. So I think that's, you know, one model that is showing promise, I would say, in terms of communities doing for themselves. But do remember that all local authorities have the revenue support grant, which has got a much less over time, but there is a kind of, you know, a distribution of central money between areas anyway, so it's quite hard to sort of disentangle what's solely central government from what's solely local authorities. But I think there are lots of good examples of initiatives that have been started locally long before levelling up funds were a thing.
Great, thanks. Those are really good examples. Does anyone else have any they want to bring in? Joe?
There's a really good project in Stockton where the council sort of, and similar to what Zoe's saying, can't just wait around for the government to decide to throw them some breadcrumbs. So they've been really proactive, the council, in using their own capital they built a hotel, basically. Their revolution is in the high street. They had two really run down shopping centres, which they took the bold decision to knock one down because they just had too much commercial space. It was making the town look run down and derelict, because they were never going to get that thriving again. There wasn't the demand. So they've knocked one down. They're going to create an urban park. They've done that through real devolved community engagement across the whole of Stockton to ask what people wanted. They've done co-design and place shaping with residents. And then they've built a hotel in part of the site, which I think they're working with the Hilton, don't quote me on that. And they lease that out, and the profits from that will then be used in perpetuity for the high street, the community park, and then restoring the pride in the town centre. I think it's just a phenomenal example of how things can be done differently, and we don't need to rely on government. And similarly, Sunderland, although it's not as far down the line as Stockton, Sunderland Council has been really successful in working with big players like Legal and General and big investors in regenerating the city centre. As how that'll play out with it, because as I said, it's moving the city centre west towards the river, so there will be the kind of old historic city centre, which is the rundown bit where people look at and go, what on earth is happening there? Our town is a mess. But you know, hopefully the council's realising that, and they have a longer strategic plan, and then that area will be addressed. And certainly some of it's being knocked down for some more quality housing, which the city really lacks outside of the suburbs. So there is exciting things happening, but do check out the project in Stockton because it's a really good example.
That sounds really, really interesting. Thanks. I hadn't heard about that one. Adam, you have unmuted. You have an example.
Yeah, so we've got a report called Levelling Up Locally, which pulls together a range of examples underneath the kind of high streets and town centres heading. I'll just pick one, which is, a lot of the good stuff is very comprehensive plans about how you change a town centre or high street. Some are just using individual powers. So Hastings in 2000 launched a project called Grot Busters, which essentially involved the aggressive use of Section 215 notices, legal powers to compel landlords to clear up the frontage and their property. And in the course of a decade, they basically got 830 buildings to completely be transformed. And that's not just that one building looking nicer, that's improving footfall, neighbouring buildings, which are often from kind of charities, community groups, therefore are more likely to benefit from people that are coming through the area. And it massively improves pride in place. Like, people that are walking by this daily don't feel like their area has been forgotten about or neglected. And I think that confidence matters. It matters economically, it matters socially. And so that for me was a good example of a council led by a council leader saying, I've had enough of this and I want to use some of the legal powers available to me in an aggressive and risky way. And I think that was a good thing to do.
Interesting. Thanks. What's that? Grot Busters?
Grot Busters.
Grot Busters. Grot Busters.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Josh. And then we've got one more question that I think I'll be able to squeeze in.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think Joe mentioned this earlier, but I think the community improvement district pilots that we're piloting at the moment in 5 places across England, I think they're quite a interesting way of building on the business improvement district model and kind of bringing the voice of local people and community organisations alongside business so that they can kind of set the strategic direction of their local high streets. So I think those kind of new models, which won't kind of require new legislation necessarily, but can kind of be advocated for, kind of important ways for us to think about tackling high street decline, because I think ultimately you kind of need an arsenal of different things tackling it. I think there's more kind of legislative change, which would be a community right to buy. I think there's funding, but then I think there's also the kind of community voice, which is what community improvement districts give people.
Right. Brilliant, thanks. And just lastly, Adam, you spoke a lot about the politics of levelling up, and we've got an interesting question on that. Joe mentioned across-party consensus being genuinely radical. Adam made the point that Lisa Nandy isn't the whole of the Labour Party, but there is a great deal of agreement between her and Michael Gove. To what extent do the panellists think there is a prospect for long-term shared focus on this agenda? So if you could give your answers briefly, that would be great. Adam, do you want to go first as you're unmuted, and then we'll go to the others?
I think there's a huge opportunity for cross-party consensus, what Danny Kruger called a Govandyism, a kind of Butskillism for the 20. I think it's a huge idea and what's really important to me actually is sometimes we talk about removing the politics from a thing. Actually, I want to inject lots of politics into the levelling up debate, because it's only through political contestation, through Labour trying to be more levelling uppy than the Conservatives and so on, that this stuff rises to the top of the agenda. At the moment, the most politicised things are the NHS and the cost of living, and that's why they are always where parties are focusing. Let's get them focusing on communities and on levelling up.
Thanks. You rarely get people calling for more politics, so that's maybe that's the radical thing that we're all looking for. Joe, do you want to come in? You mentioned the politics too.
I mean, I would love it, like the battling against politics and forgetting about the people who will suffer, which is the real people, the majority of our country. Yeah, I would absolutely call for it. And if it takes, as Adam said, more politics, raising it on people's profile, getting it in the front of the paper, keeping everybody on that agenda, because it could make real change. I'm all for that. More politics or less, but let's make it really high up on the priorities.
Thanks. Sorry?
Yeah, would love it to be cross-party, but given we've seen limited structural change through the levelling up agenda so far, I'm slightly more sceptical maybe than the others that will be achieved, and we'll look to a bold new government, whatever shape, form that is, to give structural change the the injection into this agenda that it sorely needs.
Brilliant, thank you. And Josh, you'll be lobbying both of the main parties about this stuff all the time.
Yeah, I think there's definitely factions within both parties who do agree on a lot of stuff. I think in terms of like internal party politics is about kind of how much of a voice and influence that they have within their respective parties, and I think that's changed a lot on the Conservative side since 2019. I think there's still some skepticism with some of the people who are in Starmer's team around the kind of electoral relevance of a lot of this agenda and kind of who we might be empowering. Is it kind of sharp-elbowed middle class people rather than kind of your traditional Labour voters? But I think I'm quite optimistic on devolution, partly because I think there's already that kind of cross-party consensus there, and also because I think if you're coming into power as the next government, the big challenges that you're going to want to be facing are kind of what is our relationship with Europe? How do we think about the rise of China, AI, like all these really big climate change, like massive issues? Ultimately, you don't want to be spending your time signing off spending decisions about bus shelters miles away from Westminster. So I think it's a governing reality that the centre needs to kind of free up its own capacity by devolving power out of Westminster and Whitehall if we're going to kind of have effective government both at kind of a national level and regional, local, community level.
Brilliant, thank you. That's all we have time for. Sorry to those of you who sent questions that we didn't get time to get to, but thanks to our audience for coming and their great questions, and thank you so much to my panelists as well.
Thanks everyone. Bye.